So I'm going to be moderating the last panel. We're going to do a switch because Jonathan, who is going to go, Jonathan Gold from Princeton University, who is going to be our last speaker for today, has a plane to catch, and we want to make sure that this panel doesn't run on too long. So, Jonathan Gold is going to go first, and Parmel Patel will go second. And Jonathan from Princeton is talking about what use is Buddhist philosophy constructing the path for academia.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thanks to Parmel for switching, and thanks to Bob so much for inviting me, and my profound thanks really to BDK and the Numata Foundation for their tremendous support of Buddhist studies in the Academy. This has been a really terrific day. I'm honored to be here. And I assume the reason I was originally placed last is that my talk is expected to be the most energizing and exciting. So I'll try to live up to that, even though I'm not last. So after listening to today's discussions of the state of Buddhist philosophy today, the question in my title, what use is Buddhist philosophy, might bring to mind several possible uses. I'll mention three. To start, Buddhist philosophy is an illuminating new conversation partner for any and all philosophy. Its texts provide exemplary challenging arguments and positions in a wide range of the sub-varieties charted in philosophy departments across the Academy. Second, its distinct concerns and arguments can reveal in relief Western philosophy's unnoticed presuppositions and roads not taken. Philosophers who care about advancing the discipline rather than simply replicating tradition, therefore ought to be open to engaging with Buddhist texts and ideas. Finally, since Buddhist intellectual traditions were understood by pre-modern Buddhists to serve the path to liberation, Buddhist philosophy echoes Pierre Hadot's famous critical appraisal that classical thinkers were not concerned with problems and arguments exclusively, the narrow obsessions of today's philosophers, but with philosophy as a way of life. This point and other parallel meta-theoretical questions might help philosophers reconceive their discipline. These are all, I think, good uses for Buddhist philosophy. Yet all three promotional claims, new problems and arguments, new perspectives revealed through parallels and comparisons, and even a rethinking of the discipline of philosophy, are still rather narrowly targeted at philosophers. Now, I'm an advocate of diversifying the discipline of philosophy, which has institutional benefits as well as intellectual ones. I'm always delighted when a student turns up in one of my classes in the religion department because they've stumbled across Buddhism in a philosophy course. But enrollments in the humanities are in decline, and if that cannot be changed, then even if philosophy can be reformed, there's a danger of tying ourselves to a sinking ship. Instead, let's raise our sights beyond the discipline of philosophy. Indic Buddhist intellectuals were never limited to the disciplinary norms of modern academic philosophers, and neither are most of our students. And anyway, the philosophy departments are not following Hadot. So, rather than grasping after a vain pursuit of coattails and reflected glory, having Buddhists recognized finally as full philosophers, we might be better served by trying to use Buddhist philosophy to enact a more significant kind of transformation, which is, after all, what Buddhism was designed to do. Buddhism provides a visionary worldview that just might help us to see and resuscitate the ideals of academic research overall. If Buddhism can open up philosophy, that will be a blessing. If it can provide the Academy with a philosophical recognition of its own purpose, there may still be a chance to preserve civilization this time around. Many of you know it, but not enough people are aware that the earliest universities were Buddhist institutions. Throughout the second half of the first millennium in North India and extending until the 13th century, Nalanda and its sister universities housed thousands of students who came from across the known world to pursue a wide variety of courses of study. Most were Buddhist monks, but many different religious traditions were taught and debated, along with secular studies such as grammar, medicine, and the arts. In fact, this diverse curriculum was already advocated among Buddhist monastics of the 3rd or 4th century. It is enshrined in the Mahayana Sutra Alankara. For those who valued the practice of supreme compassion, the path of the Bodhisattva, the ability to know the world in all its particulars and to speak convincingly to diverse audiences was inseparable from the pursuit of the truth as the Buddha taught it. The great monastic colleges of India were supreme expressions of the Buddhist community's confidence in the validity of the doctrine and its ability to liberate the mind and transform the world. And the method they chose for enacting that transformation was education in all the known disciplines. Some have argued that the universities of medieval Europe, which are, of course, the ancestors of the modern university, were modeled indirectly on these Buddhist monastic institutions. There are possible lines of influence extending through the Muslim world. What interests me is not so much the historical lineage as the parallel values expressed in the institutional structures and practices. Whether or not there's a historical link, I think that in the modern period, we've seen a kind of re-emergence or rediscovery of Buddhist ideas and values in the university. Perhaps the monks were right to be confident that if you study hard enough, you eventually arrive at Buddhism. So, my purpose today is to sketch a version of a Buddhist worldview and a Buddhist approach to learning, which I think we are at least sometimes modeling today in the academy. I think that since we are inadvertently adopting some Buddhist-like practices and concepts, it will help us accomplish our goals if we can fill in our understanding with the relevant Buddhist philosophical perspective. This is a point about methodology in the academy overall. I'm not saying that Buddhist studies or the study of Buddhist philosophy has necessarily generally been more methodologically Buddhist than other disciplines in the ways that I will identify. But a natural role for Buddhist philosophical studies that emerges from these observations is as a guide to the relevant conceptual space, a guide with a number of readily identifiable practical and moral benefits. In particular, I'll propose that Buddhist philosophy has a role to play in helping to shape a broader understanding of the nature of learning and progress where there is no shared ground of meaning and where all of our ideas are socioculturally embedded and interconnected. I call the view progressive contextualism, and I think it expresses a widely shared pragmatic basis for academic conversation. I will argue that adopting this Buddhist approach or something like it resolves a number of current concerns, such as those about the value of truth, criticism, and progress in the humanities. I will describe a Buddhist understanding that clarifies at least one role of the humanities in the project of social transformation. I believe that Buddhist philosophy's explanatory power expands tremendously under a socio-cultural reading of karma, something like we have heard from Kat. And with this in mind, I will suggest how meditation practice under such an interpretation is in fact a useful model for understanding what we do in the humanities. So I'm venturing into new territory. Let me just head off a couple of concerns. As Professor Sharf and others have pointed out, a relatively small percentage of Buddhists in history have done much meditating. Fine. That should certainly serve as a corrective to romantic projections and idealizations of the tradition. But it should not prevent us from looking to meditation and other forms of personal cultivation within Buddhist traditions as possible tools that we might adopt and adapt to our current situation. Similarly, Buddhist polities have tended to idealize monarchic rulership in a symbiotic relationship with a male-dominated monastic sangha. That should serve as a warning and a stimulus to critique, but it should not prevent us from looking to Buddhist ideals, political and social ideals, as well as those focused on the individual, for tools that we, again, might shape to our present needs. In short, the view of Buddhism I'm presenting is my own, constructive interpretation and development of Buddhist ideas, ideas that I've internalized and adopted after studying and teaching Buddhist philosophy for a couple of decades. What year is it? Okay. I'll make a few gesturing references to well-known sources, and I'm happy to follow up with details, but the view I'm presenting is not anyone's from the past exactly. It's intended to be Buddhist, at least as much as Christine Korsgaard's views are Kantian, or Alasdair MacIntyre's views are Aristotelian. But please don't say that I'm taking Buddhism to be philosophy and not religion, because as I've said, I don't want to limit Buddhist thought to philosophy as a discipline. And I'm also not at all uncertain that for many, many people, Buddhism is their religion. I'll stop there. So, to get into it. Buddhists believe that all ordinary people, which is everyone except Buddhas and very advanced practitioners, are fundamentally deluded about everything. Reality itself eludes us because we can only understand what comes within the range of our perception and cognition, which are conditioned by our particular body and mind existing within a particular time and place. Of course, we can't know the results of future science or the literature of other planets, but also what we do know is distorted by the fundamentally selfish structure of our awareness and biased by our never-ending pursuit of our own interests. Every idea we have, every concept, is from the ultimate perspective empty in the sense that things just aren't the way they seem to us. This applies to ordinary objects, such as in the Buddhist doctrine of the illusory nature of the self and Nagasena's deconstruction of Milinda's chariot. It also applies to specialized vocabularies. The philosopher Nagarjuna had already argued in the 2nd century that every term in traditional Buddhist doctrine was just as empty as the self. In Nagarjuna's argumentation, every concept, including emptiness itself, contains a false reification. It is dependently originated but appears not to be, and is therefore subject to skeptical critique. This idea is powerful and true, and I want to give it the minimum exposition necessary to make it obvious and broadly acceptable for modern academics. The way I'll do that is to say that a simple proof is present in the recognition that all language and concepts are bound to context. Let's say you and I are colleagues, and you and I are leaving the lecture hall, and I say it's raining before we step out the door. You are justified in thinking that I meant that it was raining just outside, but if you hold out your hand once we're outside and say it's not raining, I could say that I only meant that it's raining somewhere, maybe in Cambodia. Maybe I was being a smartass, but technically what I said could be claimed to have been true. Depending on your frame of reference, depending on context, the same statement can be true or false. Another example. My son Milo is now a fine young man, but when he was a baby, he was absolutely gorgeous. My wife Heather and her sister were laughing together, wondering about how this beautiful child could have been produced from their gene pool. Then, a couple of weeks later, Heather was out with the baby and ran into an acquaintance on the street. And the acquaintance immediately started marveling at this gorgeous baby. She said, "He's so beautiful. Isn't it hard to believe that he came from you?" All of a sudden, this is very insulting. Here, the same emotion, the same ideas, in a different context, take on a different meaning. The idea that meaning is constituted in dependence upon context is common sense. It's a view you already hold. What is strange is our aversion to it. Because although it is absolutely obvious the examples I've given are trivial, it seems like if it is generalized, our world must collapse. A profound contribution of the Buddhist view, then, is to notice and articulate the difference between the true claim of the relativity of truths, that there is no ultimate foundational non-contextual meaning, and the absurd claim that seems to follow, which is that everything is meaningless or just a matter of opinion. It's absurd to say that just because expressions like "it's raining" or "your baby is surprisingly beautiful" can be understood differently in different contexts, the words are meaningless, or that they can mean anything you want them to. No one would say that about those particular examples. The point is only that all meaningful expressions and ideas are embedded within contexts. Notice that if we could make ideas mean anything we wanted, that would mean that we have a kind of control over those contexts that we surely do not. On the contrary, the contexts that shape meaning are much larger than we are, and much less susceptible to our control than our particular words or behaviors are. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that our thoughts and actions are constituted by those contexts than to say that we control them. Think of the examples again. It is true that I can claim to have meant that it was raining somewhere, say in Cambodia, when I said it was raining. But that claim has social consequences. I'm not going to be taken as seriously next time. And even if my wife's acquaintance had planned somehow to mean no offense by her remark, she couldn't simply declare that she meant no offense. Or rather, she could declare it, but saying so would not prevent the offense. Words express what they express precisely because they are embedded in sociocultural contexts. Speakers select flexibly from a repertoire of available possibilities, but the structure and the machinery of communication is by comparison quite rigid. The roles of colleague, sister, or acquaintance, for instance, shaped the meaning of each speaker's language in a way that is beyond their control. Those roles, in turn, are sociocultural constructs conditioned by larger historical forces. It is the past that provides the frameworks in which we are able to see, speak, and understand and act. The past actions of other human beings, their speech acts, and every other kind of sociocultural enactment have accumulated throughout history and shaped the world that we inherit and in which we abide. To give it a name, it is their karma and ours. The Buddha said that our bodies and minds at birth and the world of our experience, including our social status, are conditioned by our karma. I'm accepting that. And the Buddha also said something that I don't take on, which is that we are each individually responsible for our karmic inheritance due to actions taken in a previous life. I'm happy to argue that my view is still Buddhism, and that it helps us trace the significance of our actions under a relativistic worldview and does not diminish them. Our actions are morally significant in every case that we intentionally take up and become carriers for a given sociocultural context, a given causal line. This turns out to be every time we do anything on purpose. Every time we think or say something in language, we are beneficiaries of countless previous linguistic inventors sharing and promoting their creations. And every time we enact a social role, we run the risk of reifying it for ourselves and others, or alternatively, changing its appearance so that the next time it's taken up, it will have a different cast. Thus, karma provides a model for thinking about identity and responsibility, as well as many other contemporary moral concerns that I'll set aside for now. So the fact that we and our language and concepts are embedded within a sociocultural matrix that is inherited from past actions of other human beings is really common sense. But the concern, the anxiety that we feel in relation to this revelation of our embeddedness within sociocultural contexts is real. We have a protective, defensive reaction that attaches us to something implicit in language and concepts. We are somehow conditioned to view social phenomena, which we know we've inherited from our caregivers and our social context and our education. How else do we learn language? As intrinsically real, in a way that is challenged by this observation. We continue to think, for some reason, that the meanings of words and the social identities that we are given and that we impose upon others, and the norms of our societies, and the world as we understand it, are permanent, unchanging, and independent of social or mental constructs. Perhaps we are anxious at having to reopen a problem that we thought we'd already solved as children of how the world works and how to live in it. One way the worry expresses itself is in the claim that it undermines morality. We think it means there's no right and wrong. But there is right and wrong, it's just socioculturally conditioned. It's wrong to mislead your colleagues about where it's raining, and it's wrong to insult someone indirectly by complimenting their baby. Such norms of communication are complex conceptual structures that are themselves embedded within other social constructs, but that may well be what makes them worth defending. You have reason to protect conceptual territory where you already have projects underway. You may never be allowed to claim that your view is the final ultimate truth under all perspectives and descriptions, but you can defend the pragmatic claim that you have good reasons to advance your projects and to seek allies who share your interests. Nagarjuna saw that by placing ideas in different contexts, every doctrine from the Buddha could be subjected to critique. Yet Buddhism survived this critical perspective. In fact, it was extremely productive as long as it was understood properly, because along with the idea of the ultimate groundlessness of all ideas came the affirmation of their conventional pragmatic reality. As long as you were willing to affirm that you only mean a concept or an idea conventionally, which is to say, within a particular frame of reference, with a particular kind of purpose in mind, you can call it real for all intents and purposes. The great Buddhist universities of India were dominated by advocates of the Yogacara tradition, who insisted that ideas were ultimately groundless, but conventionally eligible for research grants if they could appeal to relatively stable, practical, conventional frameworks. They didn't really have research grants, but they were in principle open. Now, the pragmatic criteria Yogacara thinkers used were those appropriate to a compassionate bodhisattva, most generally to help oneself, meaning to advance oneself on the path to liberation, and to help others. And these general projects could activate conventional talk in a wide range of arenas. In medicine, for instance, it's certainly true that from the ultimate perspective, there are no winds in the body, but this does not prevent one from making a medical diagnosis using the idea of winds that might help a patient. The fact that it helps is all that's necessary to justify the use of the term. To insist on absolute literal truth would be to neglect one's responsibility to help a patient. After all, ultimately, there are no arms and legs either. In fact, no real patient at all. Critique, therefore, is always possible, but is justified or not based upon practical criteria. One can study Nagarjuna's arguments in order to help one loosen attachment to signs, or in order to defeat a critic of the Buddhist tradition. But the same monk who's learned how to disprove the ultimate reality of karmic action and result, for instance, will still be expected to confess any violation of his monastic rule so as not to incur a karmic result. The Buddha taught a diversity of doctrines, each of which finds its proper audience among those disciples capable of understanding and benefiting from it. He refrained from speaking of no self to disciples who were unprepared, lest they mistakenly conclude that it licensed immoral behavior. The same point is said about emptiness and mind only. Different views are appropriate to practitioners on different levels of attainment. This is what I call progressive contextualism. Knowledge is contextualized within progressively structured frames of reference, but any view that helps someone advance is valid for that person, even if it is an inferior view, and will be superseded later. After all views will be superseded eventually. And only individuals who have internalized multiple views are in a position to assess and articulate their relative value. Since relativism like this requires us to acknowledge the limits of our views and build shared but relativistic criteria for assessing truth, it allows us to inhabit a shared space with and work with and respect those of different understandings. For this reason, progressive contextualism is a significant benefit to a diverse university or a functioning democracy. Thus, Buddhism provides for academia a model for how to hold to morality and how to assess the significance of individual projects in the absence of a shared ground of meaning. In recent years, there's emerged a debate about the place of criticism or critique in the humanities in the US. It's been claimed that scholarship has become too enamored of a hermeneutics of suspicion to the detriment of other ways of reading. Critique, according to Rita Felsky's book, The Limits of Critique, just to take one example, is too often besodden with its own heroic rhetoric. This is an instructive observation. But we still need a strategy for assessing the pitfalls as against the relative benefits of critique. A rule of thumb for criticism under a Buddhist understanding might be that it is right to critique a position that masks a false reification. But it would be overstepping if it failed to allow for the play of signification that is affirmed overall as conventionally beneficial. This is a rule that I've learned from the Yogacara critique of a nihilistic reading of Madhyamaka. Criticism undermines reification, but it does not necessarily undermine reality. Also, criticism is not useful in itself. It can, however, serve a significant purpose under a broader pragmatic framework. Specifically, where the object of criticism is considered important, but is misconceived. What is needed then to determine the value of criticism, just as the topic that I've taken up here, is an understanding of the pragmatic value of the humanities that includes within it an important role for criticism. Progressive contextualism tells us that a new way of thinking, or an old way of thinking, is useful to the degree that it facilitates advancement. If we want to apply this to the modern academy, we need to exorcise the demon of doubt that there is progress in the humanities. I will conclude by discussing one aspect of the path of progress for the academy from the perspective of meditation practice. The Buddhist meditation practice of cultivating mindfulness, or smrti, is intended to cleanse the mind of what are called defilements or hindrances to mental clarity, the kleshas. Traditionally, there are 5 hindrances: sensory desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, which is anxiety, and doubt. These are psychological states, afflictive emotions that interfere with our ability to understand ourselves and the world and act skillfully. Mindfulness practice is about cultivating diligent attention with the goal of seeing things as they are rather than imposing preconceptions or looking away, getting caught in distractions. The practitioner focuses attention on a series of objects: their breath, their body, their feelings, their thoughts, and so on. And each object provides the meditator a new opportunity to notice how the hindrances work to distract attention and distort perception. And they are constantly at work, in spite of the meditator's best intentions. One of our core delusions is the belief that we have direct manual control over our minds. But as beginning meditators often note, you cannot succeed by simply deciding not to be distracted by desires or doubts. You can't get results by yelling at yourself or gritting your teeth. The key method of cleansing the mind, instead, requires the meditator simply to return repeatedly to the task of observation without judgment and without agenda. A meditator can only counter a distorting pattern once they've gained familiarity with it. In fact, many distorting patterns simply disappear once they are brought into the light of attention. I hope you will notice some parallels here to the methods of research and teaching in the humanities, and of course this applies to the study of Buddhist philosophy, whether it takes place within a department of philosophy or elsewhere. We have our distinct objects of study, and in each discipline, based on self-aware understanding of our history, we've developed distinct methods of countering the distorting effects of biases and mistaken perceptions. Our objects of study are always new to us, even when we return to the same texts or events, because as our biases lift and our expectations and intentions change, we come to see them in new light, and they in turn reveal new ways of understanding ourselves. The distorting effects of the hindrances are furthermore easy to spot in our classrooms. Learning is hindered by a student's desire for lunch, or anger at a low grade, or laziness, or anxiety, or doubt about whether the class is worth the effort. A more serious analysis would pursue the dangers of attachment to conventional views and aversion to self-undermining perspectives and uncertainty. Part of the goal of our teaching and our research is to facilitate the psychological freedom that comes to students and colleagues from repeated careful refocusing with new attention on the object of study. We call it learning for its own sake, which indicates that we are engaged in a project of observation without judgment or agenda. It is a useful rule of thumb intended to prevent the biases of ostensibly practical work from distorting direct inquiry into our objects of study. But this does not mean that we are not aware that there are indirect benefits served by this practice. In addition to these psychological benefits, there are benefits for society at large, because academia, especially through the humanities and social sciences, serves as a kind of socio-cultural version of mindfulness practice. Although Buddhists have claimed their teachers to be fully enlightened, we know that biases are embedded in social constructs as well as in the subconscious. And remember, we also said that we have little control over the socio-cultural contexts out of which we are constituted. Consequently, the work of rooting out distorting biases is not a solitary project for one individual. It must be collective, institutional. It requires the intentional cultivation of shared spaces of comparatively cool consideration for the sake of developing methods of increasingly objective observation. It calls for opportunities to share and test best practices, forming disciplinary traditions. The humanities, with its critical lenses, is capable of bringing to light distortions within human discourses, past and present, and training us to notice them wherever they arise. My colleague Marina Rusto says that studying history is, quote, about dissolving our beloved constructs in the acid bath of contingency. And we can find similar ideas in each discipline. The mindfulness analogy suggests that criticism, understood as the highlighting of causes and conditions of biases and distortions within our inherited discourses, ought to be at least potentially instrumental in altering or dissolving those patterns. Although it is distressingly slow and beset with setbacks, discursive movements in the academy do have the potential to change society. Buddhism therefore provides the framework in which certain kinds of academic progress in the humanities make sense. Excuse me. The growing concern in the academy with the perspectives of underrepresented minorities and gender identities sometimes appears to outsiders as an academic obsession, academic in the pejorative sense. But it is a direct result of research in the modes we have come to value, precisely because it allows for advancement on the path to ever clearer articulation of things as they are. The laboratories in which we bring discourses to life in order to study them must themselves also be discursive. They are the sociocultural resources that we ourselves have inherited. We can only translate languages into other languages. As we seek a clearer vision of our objects of study, we grow ever more familiar with and seek to rectify the potential distortions that reside within the tools in that analytical laboratory that is our sociocultural inheritance. The distorting biases in our culture prevent us from seeing the objects we study clearly, and continued attention to the objects of study, if done responsibly, should foreground those biases. Postmodernism, with its revelations of the biases in discourse, is sometimes said to have killed the notion of discursive progress. But rather than implying the uselessness of a progressive approach, the emergence of a pervasive awareness of historical construction and bias is in fact evidence of progress in the humanities. On the model of the transformational power of mindfulness meditation, then, we may be hopeful that studying discourse, culture, and society with confidence, diligence, and attention can lead to clarifying awarenesses and eventually skillful transformations. I think that should be considered a kind of Buddhist practice. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My first question was, I think it was kind of an embedded question. You said you're accepting the notion that we're born into these, or inheriting these cultural and linguistic and social contexts, but it's without, we're not responsible for that. In other words,
no, I have a different, sorry, I'm interrupting.
Past is not somehow in play in the way we're born into a particular position in the world. And you're still calling this a Buddhist perspective,
right?
Which I'm not sure how that would work.
Right. So, thank you. So, I put that button out there for you to press. Thank you. The idea that I have is that we should think of our sociocultural inheritance as our karmic inheritance, in addition to the physical inheritance that I'm happy to say that we have inherited as well from our parents and from generations past, and through the various processes that we know have generated the physical forms that we have as well. I'm saying that it's Buddhist because I am resistant to various arguments that it's not Buddhist. If you want to say that it's not Buddhist, we have an argument to make about the nature of the self, first off. Because to me, what it gives is a very nice argument that explains no self causally across the generations. We don't need to have a self. And what I'm saying is that we are responsible for the karma that we take up and that we enact. So we are responsible to the extent that we are participating in a causal line. So if I act in a particular role as a professor or something, the mode of teaching that I adopt is inherited from countless previous beings and from the social context in which I am. I'm inheriting that karma. That's my karma. And so I'm not saying that we're not responsible. I'm saying that responsibility is constituted in the ways that we take ourselves to exist. And so I would argue about I think that the idea of rebirth, going from one life to death to the next rebirth, is a simplification of this procedure that I have a different kind of causal description for.
I have another question with someone else. So my other question was about the progressivist approach.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were comparing it to meditation, for example,
Yeah.
so we're accepting that in a Buddhist context, there is kind of a possibility of observing a mental distortion dispassionately or something of that sort and making progress. What does that look like in an academic discourse or context? Can anyone make or do a study or any kind of critique that is from nowhere, that is dispassionate, that is just observing any kind of phenomena without already presenting their own take, their own narrative on things? And is that necessarily progressing us or helping us?
Sure. So I'm not saying that you jump from where you are into the vision of emptiness. I don't assume that, but the Buddhist tradition does articulate a gradual series of practices that help to improve on the way and untie karmic knots. So the purpose of the academic reflexive awareness of bias is to create the conditions for discursive change. So disciplines change over time and they refine their understanding and they're able to see the object of study better by pushing out various kinds of mistaken preconceptions. And that's through writing articles and teaching people new terminologies and inventing new ways of thinking of things and a million other things that we do.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was really terrific. Since you're talking about progressive contextualism, I'd like to invite you to reflect a little more on, or rather use this as a stepping stone to reflect on progress in Buddhist philosophy in general. What I have in mind is there was a big conference at Harvard some years ago organized jointly by Harvard and my alma mater, ANU, about whether there is progress in philosophy. And because a lot of philosophers were concerned that we don't make as much progress as, let's say, they make as in the sciences, for instance. And so one of the things that came out of that conference was that there is, obviously, the obvious answer is there is progress. We all know.
Thank goodness. Right.
But the more important questions were the following two questions. One was, is there as much progress in philosophy as there is, let's say, in the sciences, for instance? And the related question, why isn't there as much progress? So I'd like to invite you to reflect on how much progress do you think there has been or there is in Buddhist philosophy, and whether you see the kind of model that you're proposing, progressive contextualism, as one of the ways in which Buddhist philosophy does make progress. And how does it stack against progress in related disciplines? Do you think that Buddhist philosophy has made as much progress, for instance?
I think we win, clearly, against other disciplines, and I feel bad for them, you know. So I'm not sure how to measure that, obviously, exactly. I think that in one thing that I think generates the skepticism about progress in the humanities in general is by comparing ourselves to the very evident technological and theoretical progress of the sciences. And one reason that we don't see those kinds of the kind of progress is that we're not doing the same thing at all. What we're doing is working with discourse in which we are embedded. And so what I'm saying that we do is we try to untangle the knots that culture over history has tied us in, and we try to see things more clearly, and there are lots and lots of different ways that we do that. So I think that within each discipline you can make a separate assessment in a sense of what counts as progress from this perspective. And I think that we absolutely see progress in Buddhist philosophy over the last 10 years, over the last 30 years, tremendous progress in terms of getting closer to the objects of study and also having a greater impact, and also now, finally, with my paper today, being able to create an overarching system according to which academia becomes useful for all of society.
I have to, if I get in here, the discussion of progress, I have to admit, makes me very uncomfortable. I'm not too sure what the celebration of progress is about. Like, where is that coming from? So I could imagine, for example, somebody saying it is the job of every generation to rediscover certain truths that were known by the ancients. And that's just the way things are. It's just like the job of every child is to learn to kind of function in the world. And so just to present a kind of counter picture,
Right.
I just don't, could you say something about progress and your
Yeah.
celebration of progress?
Yeah, my celebration of progress is intended to counter some of that anxiety and concern you express, which I also feel. I also think that it's the job of every generation to relearn and reconceive and rethink what's happened in the past. But I think that the way that we are aware of racism today, for instance, just to take an example, and that it is completely pervasive in our discourses, that we know that we are biased about race, and that affects the way that we see one another, that it affects the way that we act in the world, it affects the kinds of people who get hired for jobs, it affects the ways that we read, which texts we read and which way, so ethnocentrism and racism and all the other biases that we now are, that seems to me that's progress. That's obviously my view that that's progress, but it is progress, so that's good.
It's time for one more.
Quick. I think you might be intimating that the evolution of Buddhist philosophy is actually Buddhist psychology.
I guess if I understand your point or your question, I'm not making a clear distinction between the discourses in the study of Buddhist psychology and the discourses in Buddhist philosophy. And that's true, I don't draw a sharp line. But I don't think that's the only kind of progress. That is to say, I don't think that it's, so I don't think, for instance, that that a careful assessment of the nature of emptiness, which was sort of the, although I wasn't that careful in my paper, it was what I was dealing with in the first half of the paper. I don't think that that concern is less important than the discussion of the mindfulness project. I think that the clarification of concepts is part of what we're doing, and that actually can help us to notice our biases. I think that's what we're doing. But I don't think it's the only thing. Let me just say also that I don't think it's the only thing that we do in our academic disciplines. I don't think we're only freeing ourselves from those systematic biases that transcend all the disciplines. We're also noticing particular problems and things that we got wrong and relearning in each generation a new way to look that fits us.
Christian has promised that his remarks will not be more than 5 seconds.
Quick follow-up. So progress is usually understood when we have some sort of agreement. We have enough to learn to a difficult question.
Yeah.
So how we make progress in Buddhist philosophy by adjudicating who's right, either Madhyamika's right or the Yogacaras?
Obviously, it's the Yogacaras. No, obviously, that's just, you're being silly, so I'm not going to answer that question. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. The last speaker today is Paramil Patel from Harvard University, who is talking about why Buddhists argue.
It's hard to disagree with Jonathan. So I too would like to begin by conveying my deep and profound thanks to the BDK Foundation. As a student at the University of Chicago in the late 1990s, I benefited more than I can say from the Foundation's support of the Numata Visiting Professorship. As a young faculty member at Harvard in the early 2000s, I had the privilege of learning from the regular Numata professors who came to our campus. On behalf of Harvard and me personally, I would like to thank Mr. Numata and the BDK Foundation for its visionary leadership and ongoing commitment to the study of Buddhism. I'm truly grateful. As you know, Professor Sharf asked us to do two things today. First, to reflect on the state of Buddhist philosophy, and second, to share some of our work, and I should add, all of this in less than 30 minutes. Before sharing with you a little of my own work, I thought I would talk a little about the study of Indian and Buddhist philosophy at Harvard as a way of shedding some light on the state of the field, at least as I see it. I knew that coming at the end, most of what needed to be said would already have been said, and I think it was. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit, a particular story about Harvard and see if that helps us in some way add a little bit to the conversations we've already had. 3 years ago, we created a PhD program in Indian philosophy at Harvard, in the Department of Philosophy and the Department of South Asian Studies. The PhD program parallels the program in classical philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Department of the Classics. This is the first such program in a major philosophy department in North America, and we hope and trust that it will not be the last. Students enter the program in Indian philosophy through either department. They're admitted to the program after their second year in either department on the basis of coursework, a writing sample, and faculty letters of support. Every student in the program must complete all the PhD course requirements of the Department of Philosophy and all the language requirements for the Department of South Asian Studies. They also have advisors in both departments. By the end of the 2019-2020 year, there should be 3 students in the program, two of whom will work in Buddhist philosophy. The process of creating this program has already been impactful. Colleges and students in the philosophy department have become aware of and interested in Indian philosophers and philosophical texts. For example, we now have courses on Indian philosophy almost every semester in the department, courses that are taken by undergraduates and graduate students at MIT and Harvard who do not specialize in specifically Indian philosophy. Second, co-taught courses are now offered in which both Euro-American and Indian philosophical texts are taught. For example, we have a course called Philosophy Without Borders and another class called Mind, Matter, and Me. Colleagues with little interest in Indian philosophy are now hoping to include Indian material in their own courses. And finally, other top philosophy departments are reaching out to us to ask how to create such programs at their institutions, or at least expand the philosophical traditions they teach. What is slowing things down, it seems to me, is not the interest and commitment of professional philosophers, despite claims to the contrary. Rather, it is a simple fact that too many of those who work with Indian and Buddhist philosophical texts are not good enough philosophers and could not be hired and tenured in the top philosophy departments in North America. As a result, those of us who are in a position to do so need to support and train a new generation of philosophers who are, one, able to read primary texts and even translations and not just pretend to read them, 2, are able to think deeply with and about the issues that actually concerned Indian philosophers, and not just about the issues that we wish they cared about. And 3, have the philosophical skills to engage philosophically with Indian texts and the ideas and arguments they contain, whether as historians of Indian philosophy or students of epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. All of this is increasingly unlikely to happen in most programs in religious studies, I think, where, among other things, the tyranny of history and historicism continues. I thought I might also share 3 lessons that I've learned from the Harvard Project. As you can see, I'm hoping to be a little bit provocative, and I welcome criticism, even if it's personally directed at me, it's fine. So I think for 3 lessons, I think philosophy is best taken to be an academic discipline and not as an intellectual practice or worse way of life. If Buddhist philosophy is to be recognized as a subfield of philosophy, it must work within existing conventions, even if it seeks to change them. For what it's worth, I cannot think of many, if any, of those we consider to be Buddhist philosophers in pre-modern India who would oppose this idea or not be fully capable of and interested in participating in the contemporary discipline. Second lesson, language training, or at least a cultivated ability to read primary texts, even in translation, is absolutely critical. Otherwise, and it is sad that this is the case, it is still extremely difficult, if not impossible, to really learn from Indian philosophers. Most existing translations and supporting materials are, as others have remarked, inadequate, philologically, philosophically, or both. Third lesson, religious studies used to be a traditional incubator for those interested in doing work in Buddhist philosophy. This is, with very few notable exceptions, no longer the case. Why? There are, I think, 3 interrelated reasons. First, the rest of the university has discovered the rest of the world, which means that religious studies is no longer the place where the non-West is studied. Second, the rest of the university has discovered religion, which means that the religion and subfields are disappearing, if not already gone. And finally, religious studies has been colonized by historical and anthropological methods at the expense of others. What then might specifically Buddhist philosophy be? What kinds of questions and concerns ought to define a philosophy subfield with that name? To my mind, the range should be very broad. 1, we should ask philosophical questions about Buddhism as a religious tradition. For example, what is the nature of Buddhism? How many Buddhisms are there? What arguments can one give in support of or against the idea that having the right view leads to having the right intention? We should pursue such questions, even if Buddhist philosophers may not have pursued these questions themselves. Second, we should also pursue the specific philosophical questions that Buddhist philosophers themselves pursued. For example, are all things momentary? Is contentless consciousness possible? What makes an argument a good one? As well as participate in and adjudicate their debates. 3, we should see if the philosophical resources that Buddhist philosophers developed in pursuing their questions can be helpful for us in pursuing our own. And finally, 4, we should ask meta-questions about what we and they thought when they were doing Buddhist philosophy at all. Although most of my own work falls within the 2nd and 3rd categories, today I'm going to talk about why Buddhist philosophers thought philosophy was important. It is so well known that Buddhist philosophers in India argued with their non-Buddhist opponents that it's hardly worth mentioning. Yet, despite the centuries-long history of such polemics, Buddhist philosophers in India rarely explained what they hoped to gain in critically engaging their opponents through such arguments, or even how they understood the value of their own philosophical work. In this paper, I hope to show that the Buddhist epistemologists' view of the value of philosophy is implicit in their practice of it. More specifically, I argue that in the Buddhist epistemological text tradition, philosophy is primarily of instrumental value, since it is viewed as being indispensable for those who seek to understand the nature of the Buddhist path and make progress along it. My argument in support of this conclusion is in 3 parts. In part 1, I briefly discussed the philosophical goals and ideals of the Buddhist epistemological tradition, as understood by Dignaga and Dharmakirti and some of their commentators, in order to show how, from the very beginning, the tradition was methodologically self-conscious and reflected upon the value of philosophy. In part 2, I showed that Ratnakirti, one of the last Buddhist epistemologists writing in India, shared the framework of value that was constructed by his text tradition. I conclude in part 3 by explaining how all of this makes explicit the ways in which Buddhist epistemologists from Dignaga to Ratnakirti thought about the relationship between Buddhist epistemology and Buddhist practice. From the opening verse of Dignaga's Compendium on the Sources of Knowledge, the text upon which the Buddhist epistemological tradition is founded, the tradition's self-consciousness regarding the role of philosophy, and especially epistemology, is evident. In this opening verse and his own commentary on it, Dignaga very clearly explains that he composed his work in order to refute his opponent's views on the sources of knowledge and explain his own. He explains further that this is an important task, since there's a great deal of confusion about these sources, and many competing claims have been made about them. Since an account of what we know is related to an account of how we know, Dignaga goes on to say that it's important to argue against mistaken views of these sources in order to show one's opponents that what they conclude on the basis of them is also mistaken. Establishing correct views about the sources of knowledge is, therefore, also a way of establishing what is in fact the case. From Dignaga's rather brief remarks in the opening section of his compendium, it is clear that his work has a dual purpose. It's meant to reject the sources of others, and thereby reject the conclusions that they draw on the basis of them, and make public the virtues of one's own account of the sources of knowledge, and thereby support one's own conclusions. Implicit in his introductory remarks is also his views about the value of epistemology. From what Dignaga says in the opening section of his compendium, what seems to be of value is being right, both about how one knows and what one knows. And, as Dignaga suggests, it's through critical reflection upon the sources of knowledge that one is able to determine this. Why any of this should be of value, and what special significance, if any, it has for a Buddhist philosopher is not discussed by Dignaga here. In the concluding sections of his compendium, however, Dignaga explicitly links the dual purpose of his text to the teachings of the Buddha, and thereby further explains why this way of being right is itself of value. He says that his opponent's views on the sources of knowledge and the conclusions that they draw on the basis of them are not well-founded, and so are distant from the real nature of Dharma as taught by the Buddha. He also explains that it's because their conclusions do not stand up to critical analysis, and instead are transformed and altered by it, that they are so distant. This implies that what makes something well-founded is the degree to which it can withstand critical philosophical analysis, and further, that being able to withstand such analysis is an indicator of its proximity to Dharma. But as Dignaga and the tradition before him also points out, the real nature of Dharma is not itself accessible to such analysis. As a result, Dignaga's purpose is not and cannot be to teach his opponents the Dharma itself, but rather to turn them away from their false views so that it'll be easier for them to eventually realize it. The reason for critically analyzing the teachings of the Buddha is to ensure that it is understood correctly, and to show that unlike the teachings of those who oppose or misunderstand the Buddha, it does stand up to philosophical analysis. Even though what is established through such analysis is not Dharma itself, it is, nevertheless, conducive to realizing it one day. Thus, Dignaga thus identifies the analysis of the sources of knowledge as the primary purpose of his compendium, and stakes out a position as to why this is of value. He says that by exposing mistakes in rival accounts of these sources and establishing one's own position, it's possible to turn one's opponents toward the Dharma, which, despite being inaccessible to such analysis, can nevertheless be approached through it. 4 features of Dignaga's account are important to keep in mind. 1, the dual purpose of his text. 2nd, his suggestion that being right is of value in that it brings one closer to Dharma. 3, the claim that Dharma itself is inaccessible to philosophical analysis. And 4, his conviction that despite this fact, philosophical analysis is conducive to realizing it one day. These four themes are taken up in various ways by Dignaga's successor, Dharmakirti, and, as I will argue, are clearly present even in Ratnakirti's work at the end of the Buddhist tradition in India. Dignaga's successor Dharmakirti is arguably the most influential Buddhist philosopher in Indian philosophical history, and among the most important Sanskrit philosophers. In his work, Dharmakirti picks up on each of the 4 themes discussed above, as does the extensive commentarial tradition on his ascertainment on the sources of knowledge, and his commentary on the compendium on the sources of knowledge. In the introductory verse to his ascertainment of the sources of knowledge, Dharmakirti explains that he has composed this text in order to teach those who do not already know that in order to consistently acquire what is helpful and avoid what is harmful, it's necessary to know what knowledge or valid awareness really is. Excuse the translation. What is emphasized in this verse is the close connection between a correct account of the sources of knowledge and what is helpful, and an incorrect account of these sources and what is unhelpful. That there is a direct relationship between knowledge and what we take to have value, that is, what we take to be helpful or unhelpful, is clearly expressed, as is Dharmakirti's pedagogical intent. How this relates to the teachings of the Buddha is made clear in a passage that concludes this chapter. In this concluding chapter, Dharmakirti clarifies some of what he means, some of what he says in his introductory verse, and picks up on many of the themes discussed by Dignaga. He first explains, for example, what he means by valid and invalid awareness. In explaining how the two are to be distinguished from one another, he also provides an account of what it means to say that knowledge or valid awareness is helpful. More specifically, Dharmakirti points out that those who correctly understand what knowledge is claim that acting on the basis of an awareness event that has a distorted image, that is, an awareness event that is not knowledge, is not reliable, in the sense that acting on the basis of it will not reliably lead to results that are consistent with the kind of expectations that we form on the basis of it. As a result, he says that there is a genuine basis for such philosophers to say that an awareness event is invalid or not an instance of knowledge. Similarly, according to Dharmakirti, they also say that acting on the basis of an awareness event that has a firmly established image is reliable and will be so as long as the world goes round. As a result of this, he says that there's also a basis for such philosophers to say that an awareness event is valid or an instance of knowledge. Knowledge is helpful in the sense that it is reliable and does not disappoint us or lead us astray. Dharmakirti goes on to say that those who are confused about this actually end up misleading everyone, in the sense that they prevent others from accurately understanding what knowledge is, and so distance themselves from ultimately valid awareness, that is, awareness of Dharma itself. In contrast, those who focus their attention and meditate upon what is produced by a source of knowledge, and therefore conventionally valid, have the chance to realize what is ultimately valid. Although Dharmakirti is not explicit about this, it's clear that he shares the dual objectives outlined by Dignaga, namely of arguing against one's opponents, that is, those who mislead everyone, and in support of one's own position. It is also implicit in Dharmakirti's remarks that his reason for doing so is to put people on the right path for realizing Dharma by bringing them closer to it, even though Dharma itself is inaccessible to our ordinary sources of knowledge. While in his ascertainment on the sources of knowledge, Dharmakirti is self-conscious about the importance of epistemology, both perception and inference, and its relation to Dharma. The commentarial tradition on Dharmakirti's own commentary provides some insight into why specifically inferential reasoning is thought to be of value. The context for this discussion is the order of the chapters in Dharmakirti's text, which is itself supposed to be a commentary on Dignaga's compendium. One group of commentators takes the chapter called Inferential Reasoning for Oneself, the only chapter of the text on which Dharmakirti comments himself, to come first. Another group of commentator takes the chapter called Establishing the Sources of Knowledge to be first, in part since it's organized in terms of Dignaga's description of the qualities of the Buddha in the introductory verse of his compendium, and can be seen, therefore, as an extended commentary on the first half of it. Both groups of commentators seem to understand questions about the sequence of chapters as being about the relative importance of providing an account of inferential reasoning at the beginning of a text, like Dharmakirti's commentary, in comparison with providing an account of the qualities of the Buddha. It's worth noting, however, that there's not disagreement about whether these chapters are important, or even about the ways in which they are important. What is at issue seems to be their relative importance. In what follows, I want to focus on the first group of commentators, and more specifically, the remarks of Shākyamuni. In the opening section of his auto-commentary on the inference chapter, Dharmakirti himself explains that inferential reasoning is the basis for distinguishing between what is useful and what is useless. As a result of this, and since there are so many conflicting opinions about it, he says that a correct account of inferential reasoning is important. Shākyamuni, in commenting on this line, explains that what Dharmakirti means by useful is just Dignaga's account of the sources of knowledge, and that what he means by useless is the account provided by non-Buddhists. As Shākyamuni says, the reason that Dignaga's account is said to be of value and the opponent's is not is because only what Dignaga says is correct. He goes on to say that since for Dharmakirti, perception cannot be used to demonstrate this, it's only on the basis of inferential reasoning that we can distinguish between what is actually correct and what is incorrect. As a result, a correct account of inferential reasoning is a prerequisite for any kind of philosophical analysis. And so, Dharmakirti chooses to discuss it as an independent topic at the beginning of his text, even though Dignaga himself did not. In a closely related passage, Shākyamuni adds to his earlier explanation by saying that a correct account of inferential reasoning is, more specifically, a prerequisite for Dharmakirti's discussion of the Buddha's teachings, since it is only on the basis of inferential reasoning that we can arrive at a correct understanding of fundamental aspects of what the Buddha actually taught. For example, the 5 aggregates that constitute living beings, the sensory spheres, and the 18 elements. Shākyamuni says that since, in the chapter in which the qualities of the Buddha are discussed, Dharmakirti wants to show that only the teachings of the Buddha are correct, he needs to first provide an account of inference, on the basis of which he will then be able to show that the Buddha's teachings are correct and the teachings of non-Buddhists are not. As Shākyamuni sees it, the dual purpose that Dignaga outlined in the beginning of his compendium is also shared by Dharmakirti, and presumably by Shākyamuni himself. Unlike his predecessors, Ratnakirti is rarely explicit about his commitment to the ideals of his text tradition regarding the soteriological relevance of philosophy. As I will argue, however, he is nevertheless clearly committed to them and views his own work in support of them. As a way of illustrating this, I'll focus on aspects of Ratnakirti's discussion of the inference for omniscience, as presented in his demonstration of an omniscient person, in which he tries to prove that meditating upon a conceptually constructed mental object, an exclusion, in particular, the ideas of the Four Noble Truths, that meditating upon this constructed object, namely the idea of the Four Noble Truths, can lead to omniscience, the ultimately valid awareness of Dharma itself. I will argue further that his discussion of this inference provides a new perspective on his other work by revealing his otherwise implicit commitment to the ideals of his text tradition and his own understanding of their significance. In setting up his inference for proving the omniscience of the Buddha, Ratnakirti indirectly indicates the dual purpose of his work. Following Dharmakirti, he says that he will prove the omniscience of the Buddha in order, first, to argue against his opponents, who reject the possibility of anyone being able to have direct knowledge of Dharma, and two, to establish that it's possible for someone to know Dharma itself, that is, to have direct, non-inferential awareness of what is to be given up, what is to be sought out, and the means of accomplishing both. Unlike Dignaga, however, Ratnakirti does not directly say that he will be arguing against his opponent's views on the sources of knowledge and in support of his own. Nevertheless, since it is on the basis of his opponent's understanding of these sources that Ratnakirti argues against their conclusions, and on the basis of his own understanding of his sources that he argues in support of his conclusions, it is clear that there is a direct and very close relationship between the dual purpose of his text, as stated here, and the sources of knowledge. In my view, it is therefore clear that Ratnakirti accepts the dual purpose account developed by his predecessors. Similarly, Ratnakirti does not directly say that a proper account of conventionally valid awareness and the sources of knowledge that produce it is soteriologically significant, since on the basis of it, people who are distant from the teachings of the Buddha can be brought closer to it. This is something, however, that I will argue is implied in his work. For Ratnakirti, the relevant teaching of the Buddha are the Four Noble Truths, so-called, which he suggests are themselves related to the underlying truth of selflessness, the view that there is no enduring self. As Ratnakirti sees it, discontent, the first noble truth, is defined in terms of the 5 psychophysical aggregates that are thought to be constitutive of living beings. The cause of this discontent, the second noble truth, is, as Ratnakirti says, the false belief that these 5 psychophysical aggregates constitute an enduring self. That the cessation of this discontent is possible, the third noble truth, is directly explained in terms of selflessness, which Ratnakirti says is an antidote to the false belief in an enduring self. The path to the cessation of discontent, the fourth noble truth, is said to be nothing other than the conventionally valid awareness or knowledge of selflessness, which is itself established by proving that all existing things are momentary. In arguing that meditation on the Four Noble Truths can lead to a direct manifestation of Dharma itself, Ratnakirti is in effect saying that that meditation on selflessness can lead to its direct manifestation, which he says is just what omniscience is. Ratnakirti further identifies selflessness and the thesis that all existing things are momentary as the unique teachings of the Buddha, and thus suggests that they alone are the proper objects of meditation. In an interesting passage in his demonstration, Ratnakirti discusses the relationship between the conventionally valid awareness of selflessness and momentariness and the teachings of the Buddha, and suggests why he thinks that being right about epistemology is of value. In this passage, Ratnakirti suggests that to be distant from the teachings of the Buddha is to be distracted by being turned away from the truth of selflessness or momentariness. Since what distracts or confuses people in this way is their false belief in the self, successfully arguing against this view is, he suggests, conducive to turning people towards it. More specifically, it removes an impediment to following the path. Elsewhere, Ratnakirti also suggests that it's necessary to show that one's view, which in this context is the view that all existing things are momentary, is properly established. Ratnakirti provides two reasons for this. First, he suggests that since the awareness that all things are momentary is itself an antidote to the false view that there is an enduring self, arguing in support of it turns people away from their false views. Secondly, and more importantly for Ratnakirti, the proper object of meditation must be an object of conventionally valid awareness. That is, an object that has been established on the basis of a source of knowledge. Furthermore, it seems as though it must be known to be so. A proper account of such awareness is therefore necessary and of soteriological significance. It's interesting that Ratnakirti doesn't say why the proper object of meditation must be an object of knowledge, or explain in what sense his opponent's belief in enduring self is false. While he does not address this issue directly, it's possible to reconstruct his views by drawing upon the resources of his text tradition and the nature of his other work. Unlike the existence of God, for example, Ratnakirti thinks that the momentariness thesis can withstand philosophical analysis, and that it remains firm in the face of it. Insofar as momentariness is known to be the object of knowledge, there's also certainty about it, which adds to its stability. In part, then, what makes an object of knowledge a proper object of meditation is that unlike objects that are not conventionally valid and or known to be so, they are epistemically stable. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, only conventionally valid awareness events are pragmatically effective and capable of effectively leading us to their objects. It's important to note that for Ratnakirti, it's only by meditating on selflessness and momentariness that the clear manifestation of Dharma itself is possible. This is because for him, selflessness and momentariness is the nature of reality, and by meditating on it, it is possible for reality itself to become manifest or directly present to awareness. Just like a lovesick person's meditating on the form of their lover can result in that lover becoming manifest to them. In my view, then, it's clear that Ratnakirti shares his predecessor's account of the relationship between knowledge and the proximity to Dharma. Ratnakirti, like many of his predecessors, is also very clear that the proper objects of meditation are mental objects. More specifically, for Ratnakirti, a mental object whose representational content is the Four Noble Truths, or, as I have argued, selflessness or momentariness. As Ratnakirti emphasizes, it's necessary that what is meditated upon be established by a source of knowledge, in this case, inferential reasoning. Although what is established through inferential reasoning is a determined object of inferential awareness, the result of an exclusion, what is meditated upon is a determined object that one can focus one's attention on, like the form of a lover. Unlike the form of one's lover, which is based on sense perception, however, the object of meditation is not and cannot be based on sense perception. As Ratnakirti explains, momentariness, and therefore the Four Noble Truths, is not an object of sense perception. In this sense, it is like any other inferred object, such as the fire that is inferred in the standard inference of fire from smoke. One way to think about the object that is meditated upon may be in terms of an inferred object as it is subsequently brought to mind, perhaps through memory. As such, this object will be, like the form of one's lover or the concept fire, an object that one can mentally act upon. Like the concept of the inferred object fire, which is capable of leading us to a real fire on the mountain that we could perceive through sense perception, The object of meditation is also supposed to be capable of leading us to a clear, manifest awareness of momentariness. That is, the Dharma itself. According to Ratnakirti, as a result of meditation, it is possible for us to directly see the Dharma itself through a special kind of perception called yogic perception. Like his predecessors, Ratnakirti does not think that the Dharma itself is accessible to our conventional sources of knowledge. What is accessible are only constructed objects, such as Four Noble Truths, selflessness, and momentariness. But, as Ratnakirti argues in his essay, meditating on these constructed objects can lead to a manifestation of Dharma itself. Where then does this leave us with respect to the question of how Ratnakirti understood why epistemology and philosophy more generally was of value? As I have argued in this paper, Ratnakirti inherits a framework of value from his text tradition that he both builds upon and modifies. Ratnakirti's framework is built around what seemed first to refute his opponent's philosophical views and the epistemology that supports them. 2, to establish his own philosophical views and the epistemology that supports them. 3, to establish, more specifically, his selflessness, momentariness thesis. And 4, to establish that meditating upon selflessness and momentariness can lead to omniscience. That is, the direct awareness of Dharma itself. In maintaining this framework of value, he thus continues a view of the value of philosophy that is consistent with that of his predecessors, Dignaga and Dharmakirti. Conclusion. The framework of value that I have argued Ratnakirti shares with his text tradition contributes to our understanding of how Buddhist epistemologists, and perhaps Buddhist philosophers more generally, understood the nature of their philosophical work and its value. Although there has been a great deal of skepticism, if not outright hostility, to the idea that Buddhist epistemology is important for understanding Buddhism, it should be clear that the Buddhist epistemological tradition itself saw a close relationship between philosophical work and the Buddhist path as they understood it. Ratnakirti's work further suggests that, at least for him, the essence of the Buddha's teaching can be captured in the momentariness, selflessness thesis. As I've tried to show in this paper, thinking that broader soteriological concerns did not play at least some role in the technical philosophical work of Buddhist philosophers is, simply put, a mistake. Thank you.
Thanks, Cardinal. A couple of follow-up questions, largely by way of getting greater clarity on what you mean to exclude, what ways of understanding the tradition you mean to rule out. So you said a couple times along the way you made reference to the importance for some of these thinkers of helping direct others away from false views, and you talked about both refuting their views of others and establishing their own. And in Logicians, that made me wonder what you have in mind about for whom they were writing this. Who was the audience for this? Was it actual persuasion of non-Buddhists that was at issue, or is your use of those locutions compatible with other understandings of the ideal readers of these texts and how they were using this? And secondly, relatedly, I'm most often inclined to emphasize the hermeneutical value and the hermeneutical context for philosophical work among first millennium Indian Buddhists. That is, for them, as I understand it, a paramount task is always to rightly understand what the tradition transmits, right? That there's philosophical work, at least in terms of how they represent it, isn't prized for its novelty, but for its rightly discerning the. And I didn't hear anything along those lines, and so I wonder too whether your understanding is meant to be a challenge to that view of what Indian Buddhist philosophy is for, or whether instead what you're proposing is compatible with also thinking that there were hermeneutical concerns.
Thank you. So just first, this paper and me right now is operating in a very historical mode. So I did not say anything that I don't think Dignaga, Dharmakirti, or Ratnakirti actually said, and that I can demonstrate by textual citations. So I'm giving you my reading, my interpretation of what Ratnakirti, or what Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and Ratnakirti would say about the value of philosophy in their own work. So, to the two questions. The first was, who were these texts for? And when you say you're arguing against the views of others and in support of your own, what is the reference of those pronouns, in a sense? Others is anyone who disagrees with you, right? So anyone who disagrees with you, with say, Ratnakirti, is wrong, and so they're the others. Now, did people actually read this book? Were they actually persuaded? How do we figure that out? Well, we know that some people read the book because we have citations. We don't really know if they were persuaded or not. So I guess that's all I can really say. I should also say we know from other texts, not just this one, that these books were not just heard, they were overheard by many, many people. And we have citations that can also document that. The second question was about the hermeneutic enterprise. And so in the case of these Buddhist epistemologists, and in particular the later ones, we see we see a commitment to getting the teachings of the Buddha right. We don't see a lot of careful exegesis or hermeneutical work. We see the claim in Ratnakirti that basically says you can take all of the four truths of the nobles and boil it down to momentariness. So he thinks the path is you prove momentariness through a source of knowledge. Why? Because if you don't prove it through a source of knowledge and you start meditating is hard and can be boring. And if I just told you all things are momentary, it'd get a little shaky after a while. But if you actually have to go through all this philosophical training and learn all about theories of inference and prove momentariness, it's going to be fixed in your mind. You meditate upon that, it's a conceptual object, and there's a possibility of seeing that all things are momentary, which is omniscient. So there's really not a lot of hermeneutics other than the fact that they're committed to getting the teachings of the Buddha right. In all these traditions, I think. That's my story.
Thanks, Paramount. Is this on? Thanks, Paramount, for a very erudite discussion of the epistemological tradition. But I want to take you back to the beginning of your talk.
Yes.
And here I'm going to take issue with you.
Good.
In friendship and with respect.
Yes.
I think
The whole point was to elicit friendship and respect, critical comments.
You want to know why Buddhists argue? They argue because sometimes the opponent is wrong.
Exactly. As Ratnakirti himself and Dharmakirti and Dignaga say. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm now the other.
So I fear that you are far too kind to my professional colleagues and far too deprecatory of our shared colleagues in Buddhist studies. That is, that when you say that the principal reason for the dearth of Buddhist, and I would say other non-Western philosophy in professional philosophy departments, is not the lack of interest by professional philosophers, but rather the lack of availability of properly trained scholars of non-Western philosophy. I think that's demonstrably false. I live among these people. I talk to these people. I write to these people. You, too, know what the response was to the Garfield and Van Noorden piece in The Stone, and it was vituperative, racist, and hideous. When I look at advertisements for positions in philosophy coming from philosophy departments in which there are no positions currently in non-Western philosophy, and I see that the vast majority of those positions of those advertisements are advertisements for more positions in European philosophy. When I talk to people in philosophy departments, including the one here, and including many others, about this issue, as I very often do, and I'm told that they are too busy trying to cover the core, or that they just don't have space for this, or there's no interest in this, or that it's not really philosophy, it's just religion. I just hear that all the time.
Sure.
And it doesn't require your belief in my testimony. All you have to look at are listings for positions in philosophy. Moreover, when I have consulted to searches where departments have offered searches in non-Western philosophy, and then rejected all of the very good candidates on the grounds that none of them were really philosophers, they were just doing religious studies, which meant that they weren't doing Western philosophy. I see once again an extraordinary deprecation on the part of my profession of not just Buddhist philosophy, African philosophy, Chinese
Sure.
philosophy. And it's ubiquitous. You're right that there are some departments, including corners of your department at Harvard, including several other departments we could mention, where this is practiced. And it is practiced. But it is still, these are very small cracks in a very large wall.
Okay.
And when I look around at the people who are trained in disciplines of non-Western philosophy, including Buddhist studies, but also including Orthodox Indian philosophy, including Chinese philosophy, including Japanese philosophy, including African philosophy, including Native American philosophy, who are very, very fine philosophers indeed, but who find themselves competing for the 2 or 3 jobs in the country that are open for non-Western philosophy in a particular year. And I note that even people like me celebrate the fact that there are 2 or 3, because that's such an enormous increase over what we had a few years ago. I do not see incompetent people who can't get jobs because they're not good enough. I see superbly qualified people who are competing for far too few jobs because of the absolute manifest indifference by most of my colleagues.
Okay.
So I really object
Right,
to the
so-
degradation of these people.
Okay.
And to the valorization of the people with whom I work.
Okay. So I think that even if most of what Jay says is true, it doesn't actually, I think, negate the point I'm trying to make. And here's why. I think the developments that I'm talking about are relatively recent. So I've been teaching at Harvard since 2002. And these transitions have taken in the wider discipline of philosophy, not only my colleagues at Harvard in the philosophy department, but other philosophy departments in the last 10 years. So I've met very, very few of my colleagues who are professional philosophers who are not open to considering an expanded set of philosophical materials. There is a focused way in which they are willing to receive those materials. Granted, that's what the discipline of philosophy, at least as they understand it, requires. I do not think that most of the people who know this material are able to present that material in a way that's most easily heard by my colleagues. So where we disagree is on the empiricism, on the empirical matters, on whether, if we went and looked at and did a survey of X philosophy departments in North America, what kind of situation we would find. My informal survey since we created the program has led me to be incredibly optimistic. And it's not about deprecation or about criticism. It's about recognition of where philosophy is moving and about, therefore, a recognition of what responsibility those of us who are in institutions that have the privilege of training graduate students need to do. So I actually do not think the problem is with philosophy departments. We have a responsibility, if we're interested in changing what's going on, to meet our colleagues where they are. They are open to move. And I think we have examples of that. So I actually agree that some of what you're saying is true. I disagree on the extent of it, and therefore I think I still think that my view is the right one.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Jay's question or comment, I guess. It strikes me as really interesting that this particular conference, which is taking a look at the state of the field of Buddhist philosophy, is focused almost exclusively on Indian Buddhist philosophy. And so I'm really curious as to why, Bob, there weren't any papers on Chinese and Japanese Buddhist philosophy. And for Professor Patil, at Harvard, you have your new program in Indian philosophy. I assume that includes Indian Buddhist philosophy.
Yes.
Is there any move or thought or plan to include Chinese and Japanese or other Buddhist cultures and their Buddhist philosophies?
So why there were no papers on Chinese or Buddhist philosophy, I will leave to Bob. I, for one, am barely competent doing this, so I couldn't do any more. But yes, it comes with a broader recognition. We have a colleague who works in the Arabic philosophical tradition, who does stuff in the department. And there's an openness to finding good philosophers who work in other areas. As Jay talked about, there's always choices that people have to make. And when you argue for positions both within a department and with the dean, you have to make a case. And so then it gets interesting as to what the priorities are and what are the reasons for having one set of priorities over another. At a place like Harvard, you're training PhD students, so there's one set of priorities. Other institutions might be able to argue them in different ways. So I will say there's absolutely an openness. And if there were resources, I think that's something the department would pursue, depending on who's out there. So I've sensed that not only at Harvard, but at the other departments that I've spoken to in the last few years, sort of East Coast departments, well-known departments, about what it would mean to teach the work of other philosophical traditions in the department in a way that would be supportive of their own objectives and programs. So I think the answer is yes. How long is it going to take for all this to happen? I mean, as you all know, these universities work in funny ways. Sometimes if there's a donor who has resources to endow chairs in a field, you get a field. It's like that. Sometimes the sheer will of the institution decides to move in a particular direction. It's slow. It's slow. But I'm actually very convinced that as we train students who are able to work with this philosophical material well, train more, and also they have to both be good and be taught how to appear good. And appear good means within the conventions of an existing discipline, they're going to be successful.
I think we have to end here. I want to